event. A few quick announcements before we get started. I guess I have the pleasure of introducing the introducer today. For this audience, a couple of upcoming talks might be of interest. On April 25th, there's Hilary Hoynes from UC Berkeley, also from UC Berkeley, who will be speaking about evidence for the benefits of the SNAP and CalFresh program in children. So that's April 25th at noon. And then on May 16th, there's a talk by Katrina Gesso of UC Davis on behavioral interventions as they might affect water and energy use. So we have a number of other talks on lots of other interesting topics, but those are two that might particularly appeal. Starting in the fall, we have a new series of themes that we're going to be focusing on, and those will be housing problems and solutions in California, health and healthcare with a special focus on pathways towards universal coverage, and a number of different aspects of federalism, including immigration policy and cannabis policy. So that should be interesting. So now, without further ado, it's a great pleasure to introduce Nina Ichikawa, who will then in turn introduce our speaker. Nina is the policy director at the Berkeley Food Institute, with whom we are partnering for this event. We're very grateful to BFI for doing this with us. They do some very important work. They and we share a number of important values, including diversity, justice, resilience, and health. Nina has worked in both the academic world. She has both a master's and bachelor's degree in food policy. She's also worked in the policy world, working for Senator Daniel Inouye of Hawaii in Washington, D.C., and now she's been with BFI, I think, for several years. So, Nina, it's a pleasure to have you here to introduce our speaker.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kravitz, and I really didn't need an introduction because I'm introducing the main event today, but we're very grateful. Berkeley Food Institute was established in 2013 on the UC Berkeley campus, and we're so grateful that the UC Center in Sacramento exists, and we can share more of really the evidence coming out of our over 150 researchers at Berkeley and share it with the Sacramento audience. So thank you all for coming. So without further ado, I just want to explain a little bit about our main speaker today. Professor Timothy Bowles is an assistant professor of agroecology and sustainable agriculture in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management at UC Berkeley. He received his PhD in ecology from UC Davis and was a USDA AFRI postdoctoral fellow at the University of New Hampshire's Department of Natural Resources and Environment before joining us at Berkeley. His research lies at the intersection of agroecology, soil ecology, and biogeochemistry, with a focus on plant-soil microbe interactions. Current projects look at topics including rhizosphere ecology. I should have practiced that beforehand. I hope I got it right. Soil health and ecosystem services, and agroecological solutions for climate challenges. So it all feels really timely, and I know he's going to look forward to your questions at the end of his talk. He is now an affiliated faculty of the Berkeley Food Institute, and thank you so much for welcoming him.
Thank you, Nina, and thanks to the UC Center for Sacramento for having me here. It's already been a great day. I've got to meet some amazing student interns here. And thanks to all of you for coming. It's just what an amazing turnout to hear about soil. So if you're here, you probably care about agriculture. Maybe you're a farmer or you come from a farming background, a farming family. Maybe your constituency is composed of a lot of farmers or farm workers. Maybe you're concerned about the environmental impacts of agriculture or how agriculture may play a role in mitigating climate change. Or maybe you're interested in providing healthy, nutritious food for people to eat. Whatever your reason is, if you care about agriculture, then you care about soil too. But when we look out over agricultural landscapes, we really only see the surface of soil, right? We miss that whole hidden half of agriculture that is beneath the soil surface. And so that's what we'll be talking about here today, why that hidden half matters so much. Agricultural production in California is clearly very important too. California, as many of you probably know, has the highest value crop production in the United States, 17% of the total U.S. production, accounting for almost $50 billion in output. We have a huge variety of agricultural products, producing many of the country's fresh fruits and vegetables and nuts. And this accounts for a lot of jobs in the state. Nearly 3 million jobs if we look at across the whole agricultural supply chain, across almost 80,000 farms and ranches. So this agriculture is clearly very important to the state of California. But we also have a lot of major sustainability challenges as we move forward, not least of which is adapting to reduced water availability. I hope that the recent drought is still fresh on everybody's mind, that we don't have too short of memories about that 4 or 5 year drought. And we know that things may get worse in the future. We know that snowpack will be changing in the Sierra Nevada, becoming reduced snowpack and more precipitation falling as rain, which impacts our ability to store water. There's new groundwater regulation with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act that mandates that groundwater extraction and restoration will have to come into balance by the early 2040. We also have more and more competition with urban users. So by 2050 or 2055, California's population will be 50 million people. And so without further increases in the efficiency of water use in urban areas, urban users will become will be using more and more of a fraction of the state's water. There's also a lot of challenges in reducing water pollution. Since the early 2000s, there's been a lot of focus on how we reduce surface water pollution, particularly in terms of nutrients and pesticides, sediment, and more recently in terms of how we address groundwater pollution, and particularly how it affects drinking water quality. And finally, agriculture could play a big role in mitigating climate change. The state of California emits around 450 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents a year, and agriculture accounts for about 8% of that. But there's also a lot of mitigation potential, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So the central question then here that are big challenges, and not just in the state of California, but really globally, is how do we enhance food production while addressing these environmental challenges and improving livelihood? So we're going to look at a piece of this question today, and soil, the role of soil in addressing part of this challenge. So first today, I'll talk a bit about what soil health is, what we mean by soil health, and then I'll show some evidence for how healthy soils provide multiple ecosystem services on California farms. And finally, we'll talk about the strategies, barriers, and potential for building soil health in California, and what are the implications for smart policy. So first, just a bit about what soil is, trying to get us on the same page a little bit. Soil is often called the ecstatic skin of the earth. This dates back to actually Leonardo da Vinci, who kind of first coined this term, or this phrase. And this is really an apt metaphor. You know, our skin is alive. It's one of our body's biggest organs. It's the barrier between our bodies and the external environment. Soil is also living, and it is the interface between all of the rocks, the geology of the earth and the atmosphere, and the water cycle, and all of the biota that live on the terrestrial earth. So soil is composed of both inherent properties, things that, like the rocks that it was derived from, that we don't really impact on any time scale that's relevant, as well as dynamic properties. And we'll talk more about these, particularly organic matter and soil life. Soil is full of life. Soil is living and breathing. in a single gram of soil, which is about what you could fit in a teaspoon, you would find 1 billion different bacteria composed of thousands of different species and amazing soil animals. All of these different amazing creatures here, things like this tardigrade, also called a water bear. These things are some of the most resilient animals on Earth, able to withstand conditions that would kill nearly any other animal. But beyond just how fascinating they are, and they also are performing critical functions in soil. The bacteria and fungi are decomposing organic matter that enters into soil, cycling nutrients, and these animals are also involved in these processes of nutrient cycling and soil formation. The second dynamic property of soil is soil organic matter, and we could think of this as kind of the relic of everything that has ever lived in soil. All of the roots, all of the litter input from plants, the crop residues, the animals themselves, and it is food for all of the soil life. It's the energy that is driving the soil. About half of soil organic matter is carbon. Many of you are probably aware of this, and this is why we think about soil in terms of its climate change mitigation potential. And so, along with soil life, soil organic matter is supporting these critical functions of soil. And for any of us who have tried to lose weight, we would probably be very jealous of soil organic matter. Organic matter is very easy to lose, and it's really hard to gain back. And so this has a lot of implications for how we manage our soils. But when we talk about soil health, we're using this metaphor, right? We're thinking about our own health. And we could probably agree that our own health is basically an interaction between 3 factors. First, the genes that we have, so what we inherit from our parents. Secondly, the environment where we live, so our neighborhood, whether we live close to a freeway or close to an agricultural field, and the actions that we take, so what we eat, how much exercise we get. And this are parallels exactly what we mean by soil health. So soil health we can think of as the interaction between 3 factors as well. The parents of soil, that is the rocks from which it derived, the environment where that soil formed, what the topography was like, whether it formed near a waterway, and then the actions that we take to manage that soil. And so that's our primary focus today, are those actions that we take to manage soil. And these actions are impacting the dynamic properties of soil life, and soil organic matter, and thus impacting the functions that we derive from soil. And if we look at a definition of health in the Oxford English Dictionary, we actually find that functions are at the heart of that definition. So the soundness of body, that condition in which its functions are duly and efficiently discharged. So really getting back to this core idea of functions. And so what functions does soil play? Well, this diagram is from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations from 2015, which was recognized as the International Year of Soils, and shows a whole host of different functions that soil can play. Clearly, we think a lot about how soils play a role in providing food, fiber, and fuel, but we also can think about soil in terms of carbon sequestration, water purification, nutrient cycling, all of these different ecosystem services, or these benefits that we as humans derive from the environment. And so if we pull these pieces together, we can arrive at a definition of soil health that emphasizes a few things. First, a healthy agricultural soil is one that underpins not only the production of food and fiber, but also the continued delivery of these other ecosystem services beyond just the provisioning of food. And secondly, that soil health is the degree to which these dynamic properties of soil life and organic matter, have been managed for optimum function within the constraints of the soil's inherent properties. So now that we kind of have a sense of what soil health is, let's look at some evidence for how soil health impacts ecosystem services on California farms. So the first example I'll talk about relates to how healthy soils contribute to water quality. So many of us are probably aware that drinking water quality is a serious issue in some areas. So nitrate is a form of nitrogen that is often leached from agricultural fields, largely a product of fertilizer addition. And this map shows research looking at the concentration of nitrate in drinking water wells in the Salinas and San Joaquin valleys. Nitrate contamination of drinking water is linked to certain cancers, linked to health issues in young babies. And this disproportionately affects low-income communities that live in these areas that can't afford to drill deeper drinking water wells. And so the question then here is how soil health might play a role in this. That's because most of the focus for mitigating this problem has been on fertilizer management, a relatively narrow focus, an important focus, don't get me wrong, but a relatively narrow focus. So to ask this question, I took on a participatory research approach working with farmers in Yolo County, so just a little bit west of here. What do I mean by participatory research? This is when farmers are engaged in the research process from the beginning, where we're interested in learning what farmers are already doing rather than trying to tell them what to do. And so the question that we asked is, can farmers create a healthy soil where they're getting good agricultural production, but they're minimizing the potential for nitrogen losses? This trade-off between crop yields and nitrogen losses is one that we often see. The higher the yields, oftentimes the greater the potential or the risk for nitrogen losses. And so myself, along with some other colleagues at UC Davis, worked with a number of very innovative farmers in this area to look at what they were already doing, including these folks here and across 13 farm sites in Yolo County. And so across these 13 farm sites, we found a lot of variation in soil organic matter, a threefold range of soil organic matter that was largely a relic a product of management that had occurred over decades. And we found that soil organic matter was mediating this trade-off between crop yields and potential for nitrogen losses. Let me explain exactly what I mean by that. So here we have soil organic matter plotted as soil carbon here, tomato yields and potential for nitrogen losses, and this is kind of plotted at a relative scale. And I've divided these into three groups. So first, a group of fields that had high soil organic matter. On these fields, tomato yields were similar to the Yolo County average, so they were getting good crop production. But they had much less risk of nitrogen losses compared to fields with medium levels of soil organic matter that also had similar yields to the Yolo County average, but much higher risk of nitrogen losses. So you can see here we have productivity in these two systems very similar. Risk of nitrogen losses is much lower in fields with high soil organic matter. With low levels of soil organic matter, we tended to see low levels of crop production and minimal potential for nitrogen loss, but this is not a situation we want here where yields suffer. So again, this soil organic matter seemed to be mediating this trade-off, allowing farmers to produce good yields while minimizing their risk of nitrogen losses based on the management that they had used to create these fields with high soil organic matter over time. We also saw that fields with more diverse soil bacterial communities could produce high yields, but also with minimal risk of nitrogen loss. So one of the reasons for this is that soil microbes are involved in converting forms of nitrogen, converting nitrogen into forms that plants can use. And so the idea is that when we have more diverse, abundant microbial communities, they're converting that nitrogen into forms that plants can use more in sync when plants actually need it, so that excess nitrogen isn't building up that's susceptible to loss. So here you can see just a simple plot showing soil bacterial diversity and the potential for nitrogen loss. Now, while sure there's a lot of variability around here, we see this strong negative trend. So even these humble microbes we see this role for them in mediating this trade-off between nitrogen losses and crop productivity. So we'll shift gears a little bit to some other work, looking at the role of other soil microbes. Let me introduce these characters here. So this we're going to be talking about what are called arbuscular mycorrhizas. This is a kind of a mouthful, but it's an intimate association between a plant root and a group of soil fungi. And this association goes back hundreds of millions of years. And these fungi act as kind of an extension of the root system. They can go out and scavenge for nutrients for the plant, and in turn the plant gives them food and energy. These relationships are present in 80% of plant species. But one key point is that a lot of times agricultural management can disrupt these relationships. And so we've studied the role, the functions of these relationships on California farms with healthy soils. And we found that these arbuscular mycorrhizas can increase crop uptake of nitrogen, including nitrate, the form of nitrogen that's most susceptible to loss. In other experiments, we've shown that this association between roots and their fungi can decrease nitrogen leaching and decrease nitrous oxide emissions, so nitrous oxide being an important and potent greenhouse gas. So now let's shift gears a little bit now and think about a different potential ecosystem service that healthy soils could play. That is helping us adapt to reduce water availability. So again, we'll probably all remember this drought that occurred starting in 2011. And there were a number of undesirable responses to this drought in agriculture. There was, as surface water became less and less available, farmers switched to groundwater sources and extracted a tremendous amount of groundwater. Between 2011 and 2014, 12 million acre-feet of groundwater was extracted in the Sacramento and San Joaquin River Basin. So this is more water annually than urban areas are using in California. And much of this is irreversible. So as this water is extracted, the capacity of these groundwater reservoirs to store water is actually reduced. Another undesirable response was fallowing fields when farmers didn't have enough land, enough water available to actually grow crops. In 2015, this accounted for nearly $3 billion in agricultural losses and 20,000 jobs. So farmers have a number of different ways that they can adapt to periods of low water availability. They can switch crops if they're growing annuals. They can sow to something that doesn't require as much water but may not be as profitable. They can adopt more efficient irrigation technologies. Or they can rent or buy land where water is more available. And all of these are potentially important adaptation strategies, but my question here is, how could healthy soils also play a role in this, but with more co-benefits than these other strategies? We're going to talk more about our friends arbuscular mycorrhizas here. We did an experiment, a field experiment in Davis, where we had varieties of tomatoes that either could form these relationships with soil fungi or not. And we did a field trial where we grew these tomatoes either under a full irrigation or a 50% deficit irrigation. So really we're trying to isolate the role that these arbuscular mycorrhizas are playing. And what we found was that effectively the presence of these fungi, these interactions with these roots, could increase the amount of productivity per drop of water applied, so more crop per drop. So this is shown here in this table where we have the amount of yield per unit of water applied. And in the presence of these fungi, we had 25% higher crop yields both under a full irrigation and a 50% deficit. So these fungi are playing a role even when these plants are getting stressed out. We could also think about how smart soil management could increase the amount of water that's actually available to crops. So these arbuscular mycorrhizas are increasing the water use efficiency. Now, what kind of management could actually increase the amount of water that's available? So if we look at this diagram here, what we want to do is increase the amount of water that's available to roots in the root zone. So we could change the amount of precipitation that infiltrates into soil versus runs off, or we could change the amount of evaporation that occurs versus the amount of water that plants are actually using in transpiration. So there's been a tremendous amount of work done on this in California, a lot of it done by Jeff Mitchell, who's a UC Cooperative Extension Specialist in the San Joaquin Valley. And his work has shown that a combination of using cover crops and reduced tillage can improve soil structure. So what do I mean by soil structure? So a good soil structure is one where we have lots of kind of loose soil with a lot of pore space where water can easily infiltrate into soil. These practices combined cover crops and no-till also increase soil carbon content by 30%, and because of the improved soil structure, increased infiltration rates nearly fourfold. Another practice that he's looked at is retaining crop residue on the soil surface as opposed to tilling it in. This can decrease evaporative losses during the summer by 4 inches, so quite a bit of water. So again, this combination of smart soil management can increase the amount of water that we're actually getting into soil and reducing the amount that's lost by evaporation, which is not a productive use of soil water. And in terms of its role in climate change mitigation, California we've already recognized this potential to a certain extent. So soil has been incorporated into California's 2017 Climate Change Scoping Plan. Much of this is through the Healthy Soils Initiative, which I imagine many of you here in the room have worked intimately with. So part of this initiative, which cuts across state agencies, is actually incentivizing farmers to adopt certain practices that are known to improve soil health, particularly soil carbon content, as a way of trapping greenhouse gases. And we know that this is effective. There was a modeling work done 10 years ago that showed the tremendous potential for California agricultural soils to pull CO2 from the atmosphere and also reduce emissions from nitrous oxide and fuel, up to nearly 1.2 metric tons of CO2 equivalents per acre per year. So we've seen some evidence for the role of healthy soils and smart soil management. So what does it actually look like in California? How do we build healthy soils? There's been a tremendous amount of work done in how we improve soil health. Just mentioning a few studies here that are California specific. A global meta-analysis showed that cover cropping and reduced tillage could increase these arbuscular mycorrhizas by 30%. Cover cropping can also increase soil microbes and other soil animals by nearly twofold. Other trials have shown how we can increase soil carbon, both with organic management and a combination of cover cropping and reduced tillage. And many, many other studies have looked at other management practices, things like eliminating soil fungicides, amendments of compost and manure. And so we know the principles for improving soil health. Things like providing continuous living roots, minimizing disturbance, maximizing the amount of soil cover, maximizing biodiversity, both in space and time. We also know that we can improve soil health both within fields and surrounding production fields. So incorporating hedgerows and restoring riparian corridors. So the issue is not that we don't know the principles for improving soil health, but a lot of other factors. Soil health, the adoption of soil health practices is remarkably low in California and granted much of the United States. Adoption of cover crops, where we have data on this, is thought to be less than 5% of the vegetable land in the Salinas Valley. adoption of conservation agriculture is thought to be around 5% as well. So this is a combination of reduced tillage and crop residue management. And we also see low adoption of perennial cover around fields. And even in some places, this is declining, particularly in the Salinas Valley area. So a lot of our landscapes kind of look like this, with field margins that are just bare soil. If we look at fields in the wintertime, we see bare soil, no plants around. And so why is this? I just want to mention just a few barriers here. This is clearly a very complex set of issues that keep these adoption rates the way that they are. And so in these management practices, in jeopardizing soil health, they're not only causing problems for farmers for their long-term sustainability and their long-term input costs, as they have to use more inputs to compensate for the ecosystem services that are lost. It's also, of course, bad for society, as we're not getting these benefits of reduced potential for nitrogen pollution and an increased ability to adapt to low water availability. So here I've just showing some different barriers and some examples of these barriers. So sometimes we do actually have technical barriers. So for instance, in almond orchards, the way that nuts are harvested as trees are shaken, and then these nuts are taken off the ground. And there's some issues with having cover on the ground when those nuts are harvested. There are growers who are able to adopt cover crops, but figuring out how to do this can be complex. We can have knowledge barriers. In organic agriculture, reduced tillage or eliminating tillage can be very challenging. And so farmers are unsure about how to go about this. We can have economic challenges, clearly, and this is somewhat of a broader example, but for many of these practices, the adoption costs are pretty well known. But the benefits that accrue are in the longer term. They're not market-based, and they're more uncertain. So there's this tension between known short-term adoption costs and longer-term, less certain benefits that are accruing both for a farmer but also at the societal level. Sometimes policies are a direct barrier. So there are certain policies around food safety that directly conflict with the ability to use compost or manure or incorporate perennial vegetation. And sometimes the supply chains are a barrier to soil health practices. Just one example. If a farmer's growing processing tomatoes, a cannery will often give incentives for an early harvest. So farmers try to plant tomatoes as early as possible, and if they're growing a cover crop, it can make those early cover crops, incorporating those cover crops early in the season, challenging. So lots of different barriers at different types of scales. At the Berkeley Food Institute, we have one project that's just getting off the ground to try to quantify these barriers in more detail. So this is going to be occurring in 2 phases. The first phase will be a statewide survey of extension extension personnel and agricultural professionals, things like certified crop advisors, from a number of different agencies: UC Cooperative Extension, Natural Resources Conservation Service, the Resource Conservation Districts, to kind of get their perspective on what the main barriers are for the farmers that they're working with. So this allows us to get to draw on the knowledge that these professionals have in working directly with farmers and get this statewide picture level. We're also going to get a more granular focus in a number of key regions growing specific crops by doing interviews with farmers. And so what we want to get out of this is a better understanding of what the relative importance of these different barriers are for different regions, for different crops, for different types of farms, and ultimately to be able to generate recommendations for how we improve the adoption of soil health practices. So now I want to talk about kind of how soil health and soil health practices kind of cut across the goals of a number of different state programs and policies. And I want to acknowledge that many people in the room here have probably been working intimately with many of these policies, balancing the needs of lots of different stakeholders to arrive at where these are. And so it's with a great deal of humility that I talk about this. As we've shown, there are positive benefits of soil health and soil health promoting practices that get at all of these different goals of these state programs: sequestering carbon in soils, saving water and reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the context of water, potentially bringing groundwater withdrawal and recharge into balance as soils can store more water and allow it to percolate and recharge groundwater, and improving surface and groundwater quality. But only one of these programs has an explicit focus on soils. Of course, that's the Healthy Soils program. So what's the potential for these other programs to have more of an explicit focus on soils and to derive some of these multiple benefits? I want to just give an example of one with the Irrigated Lands program. And this is I'm going to draw on a conversation that I had with a farmer in Yolo County recently who was very frustrated with this program. Much of this program, which has been developed in the Central Valley to improve surface and groundwater quality, has been focused around the creation of nitrogen management plans at the farm level. And so these plans are trying to bring fertilizer inputs in line with fertilizer outputs. And that's an important focus, but again, it's kind of a narrow focus. And this farmer, she was going to a meeting to try to get her plan certified. And she said that she'd been to a couple of these meetings, and the focus had always just been on the so-called 4 R's of fertilizer management: the right rate, the right place, the right time, and the right form. And she asked, well, I'm using cover crops, I'm using compost, using these different nitrogen sources. The cover crops in particular actually have a direct impact on nitrogen loss. So how do I incorporate these in my nitrogen management plan? And the answer was effectively, well, we don't have a mechanism for that. You're going to have to figure it out on your own. And so these nitrogen management plans actually end up being more of a burden on farmers who are using alternative sources of nitrogen and who are using cover crops. And so, one thing that we could think about is how can we not make these a burden, but actually incentivize, the adoption of these practices that we know are getting directly at reducing nitrogen losses. So again, if we can think about how to incorporate soil health and soil management into multiple programs, we could be deriving more of cross-cutting benefits instead of keeping these kind of siloed in the way that they are. So just wanted to think through some kind of broad recommendations here. So first, we still need to support participatory applied research, working with farmers and the innovations that they're creating to learn more about how we get around technical barriers. We need to develop communities of practice among farmers and researchers and other stakeholders so that innovations can spread. Farmers like to learn from each other. Like the Healthy Soils program, we need to continue to think about how we can reduce adoption costs with incentives and keep that a budgetary priority. We need to support research that better quantifies the non-market benefits of using these practices, the benefits to society, so that we can show people that investing in these is important and essential. And we need to work with supply chains to improve buy-in, to allow some flexibility in their practices. And finally, as I mentioned, kind of think about how we're incorporating healthy soils and soil management into multiple programs and policies. And so then I ask kind of a rhetorical question here. So if you want to live a long and healthy life, what do? You take care of yourself now. You invest in your health early and often so that in 20 or 30 or 40 years, you're in better shape. And that's how we need to start thinking about our soils. Not just in the short term, but also what do we want our soils and California agriculture to look like in the longer term. And so I close with some parting wisdom from somebody much smarter than me, so the late Stephen Hawking. And he said, remember to look up at the stars and not down at your feet. I would humbly submit that we revise this. So we need to remember to look not just up at the stars, but also at what's beneath our feet if we want to create a more productive and sustainable future. So with that, thank you so much, and I'd be happy to take questions.